Solomon Islands, late 1943. The morning sun climbs above a jungle ridge, spilling light across an airstrip carved out of coral and palm roots. A small crowd of American pilots and engineers stands around a strange shape resting in the humid stillness. A captured Japanese bomber, its olive-green skin dulled by salt and smoke. The rising heat shimmers around the bullet hole stitched along its fuselage. Painted on the tail are faded red suns, the unmistakable mark of the Empire of Japan. But it's the aircraft itself that holds everyone's gaze. Long, slender wings, a body too smooth, too fragile. The engineers move closer, tracing their hands over thin metal plates and exposed wiring. One of them frowns, taps the wing twice, and looks back at the others. They've seen enemy planes before. Zeros, dive bombers, torpedo aircraft, but nothing like this. Inside the cockpit, the smell of scorched oil lingers. The crew seats are charred, but intact. Then someone opens the inspection hatch beneath the wing. And that's when they notice it. The bomber's massive fuel tanks, fully exposed and unprotected. A silence spreads through the group. The realization hits all at once. In the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood at the height of its confidence. Its carrier fleet was modern, its pilots among the best in the world, and its aircraft designs light, fast, and built for long-range strikes across the vast Pacific. Yet beneath that confidence lay a defining philosophy, one that would ultimately become Japan's most tragic design flaw. The Mitsubishi G4M, later codenamed Betty by the Allies, was born from that belief. In 1937, Japanese naval strategists issued a bold request: a bomber that could fly more than 3,000 miles, carry a full torpedo or bomb load, and outrun any enemy fighter. It was an almost impossible demand, a machine that would reach deep into the Pacific, strike without escort, and return home safely on its own power. At Mitsubishi's design offices in Nagoya, engineers led by Kijiro Honjo took on the challenge. To meet the Navy's range requirement, they stripped the airframe of everything that added weight. No self-sealing fuel tanks, no armor plating, and minimal internal bracing. What emerged was a slender, graceful aircraft, the G4M1, light enough to glide across ocean distances few bombers could reach. In test flights, it was extraordinary. The Betty's twin Mitsubishi Kasei engines gave it a cruising speed over 230 miles per hour and a combat range unmatched by any bomber of its class. To Japanese admirals, this was the embodiment of their doctrine, Kogeki Sen, the offensive spirit. Speed and reach were their protection, agility their defense. The world soon saw what that meant in action. When Japan struck across the Pacific in late 1941, Betty bombers led many of the first devastating attacks. From Clark Field in the Philippines to the sinking of British warships HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya, they demonstrated terrifying reach and precision. American, British, and Dutch forces quickly learned to respect the green silhouette with its long wings and glazed nose. But even then, U.S. intelligence officers noticed something strange in intercepted reports. Pilots who survived attacks often described Betty bombers as exploding in midair after taking only a few hits. The cause was unclear, until later, when fragments of wreckage revealed scorched fuel lines and ruptured tanks. Still, in 1942, few inside Japan saw reason to worry. Early victories reinforced the Navy's conviction that offense was the only form of defense. Engineers argued that self-sealing tanks or armor would add hundreds of kilograms and shorten range, a compromise they believed unacceptable in an island nation dependent on long-distance strikes. It was a design born not of ignorance, but of strategic necessity and cultural conviction. In Japan's military ethos, protection was seen as weakness. Aircraft, like warriors, were expected to sacrifice if needed. Pilots were trained to complete their mission even if their aircraft caught fire. Some were told to consider dying in flames an honorable end. At first, this belief system appeared to work. Betty crews could fly from bases on Formosa or Rabaul and strike targets thousands of miles away. Their aircraft could carry torpedoes capable of crippling Allied warships. In the opening year of the war, that combination of range and aggression made the Betty a symbol of Japan's unstoppable advance. Yet as the Pacific War deepened, new American aircraft entered the skies: the rugged Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and later the faster F-6 Hellcat. They could intercept Betty formations before they reached their targets, forcing engagements far from home. What once was an advantage, the lack of protection, now turned fatal. Still, the GM-41, or Betty, remained the workhorse of the Navy. Production continued at Mitsubishi and Nakajima factories, even as losses mounted. Reports of entire bomber formations wiped out over the Solomon Islands reached Tokyo, but few changes were made. Engineers proposed armor plating and tank sealing, but senior officers dismissed the idea. The aircraft's range would drop, and Japan's offensive spirit would suffer. In 1943, however, those decisions would face a reckoning. On small islands and jungle airstrips, wrecked Bettys littered the beaches. Fragile shells burned black against the coral. And when one of those aircraft fell into Allied hands intact, the Americans finally saw, up close, the philosophy that had doomed so many of its crews. The question now wasn't what the Betty could do, but why it was built that way. By early 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy's reach had begun to shrink. The same skies that once belonged to the Betty were now dominated by American interceptors, faster, tougher, and increasingly numerous. The promise of the G4M's long range no longer compensated for its greatest weakness: it could not take a hit. The first real signs of this vulnerability came during the Solomon Islands campaign. Betty bombers based at Rabaul and Cavite were tasked with striking Allied convoys around Guadalcanal, long, dangerous missions over open ocean. Each flight demanded precision navigation and absolute discipline, but to the men who flew them, every sortie was a gamble. In combat reports from the U.S. Navy's Cactus Air Force, pilots described astonishing scenes: entire formations of Bettys erupting into fireballs after a single burst from 50-caliber guns. Once ignited, the aircraft's vast fuel load, more than 1,500 gallons, turned it into a torch. Crews rarely had a chance to bail out. The Japanese nicknamed their own bomber Hamaki, meaning cigar, because it burned so easily. Allied pilots soon learned to exploit this flaw. They aimed directly for the wings, where the unprotected tanks were housed, or the fuselage, where fuel lines ran unshielded beneath the floor. A few hits could send even an undamaged bomber tumbling from the sky. For Japanese commanders, the losses were devastating. Between August and December 1942, more than 300 Betty bombers were destroyed over the Solomons alone. Squadrons that once launched with confidence now struggled to survive a single mission. Still, replacements kept coming, and so did the belief that range was worth the sacrifice. But in the Pacific jungle, opportunity came by accident. In the spring of 1943, an American reconnaissance patrol discovered a largely intact G4M crash-landed near Bougainville. The bomber had been forced down by engine trouble, and its crew had fled before capture. Miraculously, the airframe was mostly undamaged, engines intact, fuel tanks still visible, the structure sound enough for inspection. For Allied intelligence, this was a rare treasure. Within weeks, teams of U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces engineers were dispatched to examine it. Crates of tools, measuring equipment, and notebooks arrived on the small airstrip where the Betty lay silent beneath tarps. Each rivet, wire, and pipe told a story, and what they found astonished them. The first discovery was the fuel system. The tanks, 4 large aluminum cells inside the wings, were completely unprotected. No rubber lining, no self-sealing mechanism, just thin metal wrapped around high-octane fuel.
A single tracer round could penetrate and ignite the vapor instantly. Engineers noted the absence of armor plating even around the pilot's seat and engine nacelles. The only modest protection was a thin steel bulkhead behind the cockpit, barely a quarter-inch thick. They also found that the fuselage skin was unusually thin, in some places just 1 millimeter thick. Every pound saved was turned into fuel range, one report later stated. The conclusion was clear. This aircraft had been designed as a flying gas tank, trading survivability for endurance. Yet, paradoxically, this same design had allowed Japan's early dominance. With its extraordinary range, the Betty had struck targets Allied bombers could never reach in 1941. That trade-off, protection for distance, had once made sense. But by 1943, in a sky filled with long-range American fighters, it was suicide. When word of the inspection reached U.S. commands, it sparked new respect and disbelief alike. The aircraft's engineering was brilliant, efficient, elegant, ruthlessly optimized. But it was also fatally naive about the changing face of war. America's doctrine valued survivability. Japan's prized range and aggression. The difference was now visible in every bullet hole. As engineers cataloged each system, they realized the larger truth. Japan's air power philosophy had reached its limit. The Betty's design could not evolve fast enough to survive the new age of high-speed air combat. By the time the Americans finished their evaluation, the war had already moved on, toward Rabaul, Truk, and the heart of Japan's empire. But those lessons from that single captured bomber would shape Allied understanding of their enemy's mindset more clearly than any intercepted message ever could. And in the months to come, those same design flaws would play a direct role in one of the most shocking moments of the Pacific War, when the Betty carried Japan's most famous admiral on his final flight.
Angle 1. Technological trade-offs. Range over survival. To understand the Betty, one must understand the obsession that created it. Japan's naval planners viewed distance as destiny. In a war spread across thousands of miles of ocean, range wasn't just an advantage, it was survival. Every design choice made by Mitsubishi's engineers stemmed from that singular requirement. The G4M's range exceeded 3,000 miles, an extraordinary achievement for a twin-engine bomber in 1939. It was made possible through extreme weight saving, no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and minimal internal structure. The Betty's aluminum skin was so thin, the mechanics joked a wrench dropped on the wing could puncture it. By comparison, American bombers such as the B-25 Mitchell or the B-17 Flying Fortress were built like flying fortresses indeed, reinforced frames, armored cockpits, and self-sealing tanks. Their crews could limp home even after catastrophic damage. The Betty, on the other hand, offered no second chances. Yet the Japanese design wasn't foolish. Its efficiency was engineering brilliance. Streamlined fuselage, retractable landing gear, and powerful Kaze engines, giving it range unmatched by any other bomber of its type. In theory, it could attack from beyond the reach of enemy fighters, but only as long as Japan held the initiative in the Pacific. That was the fatal flaw in the equation. The G4M's design worked perfectly when Japan was winning, but as the tide turned and American fighters reached farther into the Pacific, the same design became a death sentence. The Betty was too light to defend itself, too large to evade, and too fragile to withstand return fire. It was a masterpiece built for a war Japan could no longer fight. Angle 2. Human cost. The courage of the crews. Behind every Betty that went down in flames was a crew that knew the odds. Japanese airmen understood the aircraft's vulnerability from the first missions over Guadalcanal in New Guinea. They called it the Type 1 lighter, a grim nickname acknowledging its tendency to ignite instantly under fire. Yet they continued to fly. Most Betty crews were hand-picked veterans of earlier naval aviation programs, trained in extreme endurance and precision. They were disciplined to an almost ritual level.
Pilots and gunners drilled in tight formation flying, often over water where navigation errors meant death. Their bravery bordered on fatalism. In letters recovered after the war, some pilots described how they'd seen comrades burn alive mid-air, yet accepted it as the price of duty. One wrote, "We cannot protect ourselves, but our duty is to strike first and harder. The spirit of the samurai must guide us, not the armor of the West." Japanese military culture reinforced this mindset. Self-preservation was secondary to mission success. The bomber itself became a symbol of sacrifice, the idea that endurance and will could overcome material weakness. When U.S. pilots later examined captured Bettys, they struggled to understand how anyone could willingly fly such a machine. The answer was both cultural and psychological. For Japan, the concept of gyokusai, honorable death in service of the emperor, gave meaning to survival's absence. Every sortie launched in a Betty was a quiet acceptance of mortality. They flew knowing that one tracer round could turn the plane into a furnace, yet missions continued daily. It was not madness, but discipline, a deeply ingrained belief that courage could substitute for steel. Angle 3. Tactical dominance, the early triumphs. In the war's first months, that philosophy seemed unassailable. Betty bombers spearheaded some of Japan's most dramatic victories. On December 10, 1941, barely 3 days after Pearl Harbor, a formation of G4Ms launched from Saigon struck the British warships Prince of Wales and Repulse off the coast of Malaya. With astonishing precision, their torpedoes turned both ships into blazing wrecks, the first time in history capital ships were sunk solely by air power at sea. That moment vindicated everything the Japanese Navy believed about its doctrine. The Betty's range allowed it to attack beyond the limits of Allied fighters, while its speed and coordination made its interception nearly impossible. Its success inspired both fear and admiration across the Pacific. From the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, the G4M served as Japan's long arm, destroying airfields, harbors, and supply routes before Allied defenses could respond. U.S. commanders at the time reported that no sea lane was safe within 1,000 miles of a Japanese base. But even amid those triumphs, cracks were forming. Allied intelligence noted that many Betty losses were self-inflicted, fuel fires from minor hits, or mechanical strain from overextended flights. As U.S. radar networks expanded and new fighter types arrived, the Betty's long, vulnerable approach routes became death corridors. Its tactical supremacy, like Japan's early conquests, was built on temporary imbalance. The bomber's triumphs in 1941 and early 1942 created a myth of invincibility, one that the pilots themselves knew would not last. By mid-1943, the myth would collide with the hard physics of aerial warfare. The Betty's greatest strength was now its greatest weakness. Angle 4. Enemy perspective. How American pilots turned the Betty's weaknesses into strategy. For American fighter pilots, learning to face the Betty bomber was like solving a deadly puzzle. At first, they feared its long-range capabilities and heavy armament, 5 or more machine guns, including a 20mm cannon in the tail. But after the early clashes over the Solomons and New Guinea, patterns began to emerge. Pilots from the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps noticed something strange. Betty formations didn't maneuver much under attack. They couldn't. The aircraft's large wings and unarmored frames couldn't withstand high G turns. When hit, they didn't trail smoke like Allied bombers, they erupted. By mid-1942, fighter squadrons across the South Pacific shared an informal doctrine: hit the Betty once and she's gone. P-38 and F-4F pilots learned to dive on Bettys from above, striking the wings or fuselage near the fuel tanks. A few well-placed 50-caliber rounds could tear the plane apart. Veteran pilot Ken Walsh later recalled, "You didn't chase a Betty, you aimed for her heart, and she'd light up like a torch." American intelligence circulated these lessons widely, turning the Betty's weaknesses into a tactical textbook. Training films and briefings emphasized its lack of protection. Pilots were told to exploit the design ruthlessly. For the U.S., every intercepted Betty was not just a kill, but a revelation. Each explosion in the sky confirmed that Japan's air doctrine, once feared, was now predictable and exploitable. The more the Americans learned, the faster the tide turned. By the end of 1943, the Betty was no longer a symbol of Japanese reach, it had become a warning of Japanese fragility. Angle 5. Leadership and Doctrine. Yamamoto's Fatal Flight. No story captures the contradictions of the Betty bomber better than that of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's most revered naval strategist. On April 18, 1943, Yamamoto boarded a G4M1 Betty on Bougainville for an inspection tour of frontline bases. His staff had warned him the route was dangerous. U.S. codebreakers were known to be monitoring communications, but Yamamoto, disciplined and fatalistic, insisted on proceeding as planned. The aircraft he boarded was standard issue, unarmored, unprotected, its fuel tanks filled to capacity for the long flight over the Solomon Sea. Escorting Zeros provided limited cover, but in clear skies, they were easily tracked. Unknown to Yamamoto, the U.S. Navy had already intercepted his itinerary through decoded messages. Operation Vengeance was launched. 18 P-38 Lightnings were dispatched from Guadalcanal to intercept his flight. They caught the formation over the jungles of Bougainville. The Betty carrying Yamamoto was hit first. Gunfire from Captain Thomas Lanfear's P-38 tore into the bomber's wing, igniting the unsealed tanks instantly. The aircraft became a streak of flame, crashing into the jungle below. None of its crew survived. It was a moment of strategic triumph for the Allies and a symbolic catastrophe for Japan. The very aircraft that embodied the Navy's offensive spirit had become the instrument of its greatest loss. Yamamoto's death exposed the ultimate flaw in Japan's doctrine, the blind faith that speed and willpower could overcome material weakness. The Betty's vulnerability wasn't just mechanical, it reflected the mindset of a military unwilling to compromise philosophy for pragmatism. Angle 6. Moral and Philosophical Dimension. The Tragedy of Belief. The story of the Betty bomber is not just about engineering, it is a parable about belief, how conviction, when absolute, can blind even the most brilliant minds. The Japanese Navy's devotion to the offensive spirit produced one of the most elegant aircraft of the war, but also one of the deadliest for its own crews. The G4M was the embodiment of a nation's will to strike far and fast, built on the assumption that courage could compensate for vulnerability. To Western observers, this seemed irrational. To the Japanese command, it was duty. They believed in spiritual superiority, that the strength of a pilot's heart could outweigh the thickness of his armor. That faith carried Japan through its early triumphs, but when the war turned against them, it trapped them in their own ideology. The captured Betty, examined by U.S. pilots, was not just an artifact of enemy technology, it was a window into a different worldview. To Americans, protection and redundancy were the foundations of victory. To Japan, such measures symbolized weakness, hesitation, a lack of resolve. And so, in the flames of the Pacific skies, two philosophies collided, one of faith, one of pragmatism. The wrecks scattered across the islands told the outcome without words. As engineers finished their analysis of the captured bomber, they understood that Japan's aviation brilliance had been undermined not by ignorance, but by conviction. The Betty had been built on belief, and belief alone cannot stop bullets. The fatal flaw was no longer a mystery. It was written into the very soul of the machine.
The captured Betty lay on a remote airstrip in the Solomon Islands, surrounded by silence broken only by the buzzing of insects and the distant hum of Allied patrol planes. Months of fighting had left the region scarred, but what rested here, the first largely intact G4M bomber ever recovered by the Allies, promised something more valuable than any wreckage: insight. U.S. Army Air Forces and Navy engineers arrived in small teams, each carrying clipboards, cameras, and the quiet curiosity of men about to open a mystery. The bomber had been hastily camouflaged by retreating Japanese troops before they abandoned it. Though one landing gear had collapsed and a few panels were scorched, the airframe was remarkably whole. The engineers approached cautiously. They knew this was no ordinary inspection. This was their chance to study the very machine that had haunted Allied fleets since 1941. For nearly 2 years, Betty bombers had rained torpedoes and bombs across the Pacific. Now one of those same aircraft lay still under their hands. They started with the exterior. Measurements were taken along the wings, at astonishing 81 feet in span, sleek and narrow like those of a glider. The fuselage was slender, the tail tall and graceful. "This thing was built for speed," one officer murmured, running his hand along the paper-thin skin of the wing. "But that's not armor, that's aluminum foil." When they tapped the panels, the sound was hollow, almost fragile. One engineer shook his head in disbelief. A single bullet through here, and it's done. Then came the discovery that stunned everyone. Beneath the right wing, a technician unscrewed the access hatch to inspect the fuel lines. What he saw made him step back instinctively. 4 massive aluminum fuel tanks, bare and gleaming in the light, with no rubber lining, no self-sealing coating, no protection of any kind. The Japanese hadn't even attempted to armor them. They were simply exposed containers of aviation fuel running through the heart of the plane. It was the very flaw Allied pilots had guessed at but never confirmed. Every Betty that exploded in midair had done so because of this, an unprotected, unshielded system that turned the bomber into a flying torch. The technicians began documenting every component. They traced the fuel lines through the fuselage, noting how they ran beneath crew positions, the navigator's seat, the radio operator's console, completely unshielded. The rear gunner's compartment, once thought to have protective plating, was little more than thin alloy sheets. Even the cockpit had no bulletproof glass. Inside the cabin, the Americans found the controls beautifully simple, light, precise, and elegant in layout. Every inch of the design screamed efficiency. It was a pilot's aircraft, smooth, responsive, aerodynamic. But it offered nothing in return for survival. Everything about this thing was built around one idea, an engineer noted in his report. Get there, drop your load, and pray you don't get hit. In another inspection log, a Navy officer wrote bluntly, "The G4M is the most impressive piece of engineering built for the least survivable purpose." The Americans ran weight calculations. The Betty was over 4,000 pounds lighter than a B-25 Mitchell, with comparable engines and a longer range. The difference, they realized, came entirely from what the Japanese had left out: armor and safety. They even inspected the bomb bay and discovered the plane's center of gravity had been meticulously balanced for long-distance missions, allowing it to carry a 1,000-kilogram torpedo over 1,200 miles. The brilliance of the design was undeniable, but so was its cruelty. Every choice told the same story. In Japan's pursuit of range, human life had become expendable weight. Once the initial inspection was complete, the Betty was reassembled for limited ground tests. Mechanics replaced damaged wiring, cleaned the engines, and filled the tanks, cautiously, given what they'd learned. The Kaisei engines roared to life, their deep radial growl echoing across the airfield. The plane trembled, alive once more. Pilots stood nearby, watching in silence. The bomber taxied a few feet, its long wings slicing through the humid air like a ghost of the war still raging. Some of the men couldn't help but feel a strange respect for it, for the engineers who had built something so fast, so precise, and yet so utterly doomed. When the engines shut down, the team gathered around the nose. The commanding officer summarized what everyone was thinking. This thing's a masterpiece and a death trap. Their notes and photographs would soon be sent to Pearl Harbor, then Washington, where analysts would pore over every detail. The Betty's anatomy was now fully understood, its secrets stripped bare. What the Americans had captured was not just an aircraft, but a philosophy. And that philosophy, they realized, had already sealed Japan's fate in the skies. Because in a world where survival and firepower ruled, faith and courage alone could no longer keep a plane in the air.
Days after the first inspection, the American engineers began conducting detailed flight analysis reports on the captured Betty. The data they compiled revealed a brutal truth. The bomber's beauty was matched only by its fragility. One pilot, Major Frank Taylor, a test pilot with combat experience over Guadalcanal, was chosen to perform a series of taxi runs and low-altitude tests. The bomber had been carefully refitted and stripped of live ammunition, but even so, no one envied Taylor's assignment. Before takeoff, he reportedly joked, "If this thing catches fire, at least I'll know why." As the Beatty's twin Mitsubishi G4M engines roared to life, the air shimmered behind the propellers. The long wings lifted gracefully with minimal speed, a testament to the design's aerodynamic genius. From the ground, the aircraft appeared almost effortless, slicing through the humid Solomon air like a bird designed for endurance. But beauty, the Americans quickly realized, came with a cost. During flight, the Beatty responded with uncanny smoothness, its controls feather-light and perfectly balanced. But the moment Taylor throttled up, the engine strained, and the wings flexed unnervingly. The aircraft's structure, though efficient, was alarmingly delicate. "It feels alive," Taylor radioed in. "Too alive." After just 30 minutes, the flight was called off. On landing, mechanics found rivets loose along the fuselage seams and minor fuel leakage along one of the right-wing tanks, a chilling reminder of what every Japanese crewman had faced in combat. When the inspection teams compiled their final reports, the numbers painted an even clearer picture. Fuel capacity? Over 1,000 gallons, none of it self-sealing. Armor protection? Virtually zero. Defensive weaponry? 6.7mm machine guns, one 20mm cannon, yet almost no armor for the gunners. Cruising range? Over 2,800 kilometers, nearly double that of comparable American bombers. Weight savings due to lack of protection? Roughly 2,000 kilograms. To the engineers, it was now evident what had driven this design philosophy. Japan's war in the Pacific demanded range, vast oceanic range to strike distant islands and ships. The Imperial Navy had insisted on a bomber that could reach targets thousands of miles away without relying on forward bases or aircraft carriers. The Beatty had delivered exactly that, but at a staggering cost. Reports from Allied intelligence soon confirmed that Japanese air crews knew their aircraft's vulnerability all too well. Pilots even nicknamed it the Type 1 lighter, because when hit, it burned instantly, often mid-air, engulfing the entire fuselage in seconds. One Japanese gunner had written in his diary, later recovered from a downed plane, "When the bullets hit the tank, the plane becomes fire. We pray the enemy misses the first shot." For American pilots who had fought them, that sentence hit hard. Back in Pearl Harbor, analysts from the Technical Air Intelligence Unit compared the Beatty's structure to U.S. bombers like the B-25 Mitchell and B-26 Marauder. The contrast was staggering. Where American designs used layered protection and self-sealing tanks, rubber-coated, multi-chambered, built to contain explosions, the Beatty had traded all of it for distance. One engineer summed it up in a report to Washington. "The Japanese G4M demonstrates the ultimate expression of offensive design over defensive survival. It is the embodiment of sacrifice through engineering." And yet, there was an irony buried in the data, an irony that haunted those who studied the plane. Despite its suicidal design, the Beatty had accomplished some of Japan's greatest wartime feats. It was the bomber that launched the attack on Clark Field in the Philippines in 1941, crippling American air power in the opening hours of the war. It was the same model that carried Admiral Yamamoto on his final flight in April 1943, when American P-38s intercepted and killed him over Bougainville. And later, it was the same aircraft that would deliver Japan's first kamikaze units toward Allied fleets. The Beatty, it seemed, was both a symbol of brilliance and tragedy, a reflection of Japan's wartime mindset, where range and loyalty mattered more than armor and survival. By 1944, Allied pilots had learned to exploit its weakness completely. The phrase, "light up the Beatty," became grimly common among Navy aviators. American Hellcats and Corsairs would target its fuel tanks first, knowing that even a few rounds could turn it into a burning comet spiraling toward the sea. Back at the Solomon Islands airfield, the captured bomber stood as a silent relic, a monument to misplaced priorities. Engineers would later dismantle it for transport, creating the fuselage and wings for shipment to the United States for further study. But before the pieces were packed away, one of the pilots, a veteran of Midway, scribbled a note in chalk on the fuselage. It read simply, "Speed isn't worth dying for." That phrase would later circulate among Allied pilots and intelligence officers who examined the Beatty in the years after the war. The G4M had taught them something profound, not just about enemy technology, but about the limits of human endurance and faith. Because in the end, even the most beautifully designed aircraft can't save the men who fly it if it's built to burn.
By early 1944, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber's vulnerabilities were no longer a mystery to either side. American pilots had dissected its weaknesses through hard-won experience, and Japanese aircrews had paid the ultimate price to prove them true. In every major theater of the Pacific, reports flowed in from Allied intelligence units confirming the same story. The Betty burned easily, fell quickly, and rarely left survivors. Yet even in the face of mounting losses, Japan continued to produce it, over 2,400 units by war's end. The reason was both strategic and psychological. Japan's wartime economy was collapsing under the strain of blockade and bombing. Aluminum was scarce, steel even scarcer, and self-sealing fuel tanks required materials Japan no longer had in abundance. The Imperial Navy had to prioritize output and range, not protection. Mitsubishi's engineers proposed upgrades: heavier armor plating, smaller tanks, improved venting systems. But Naval Command refused. Any increase in weight would shorten the range, and for Japan, range meant reach, the ability to strike far-off targets across the Pacific. To them, an unarmored bomber that could hit a fleet 1,500 miles away was more valuable than a protected one that couldn't reach it. That mindset had been forged years earlier, back in the 1930s, when Japan still saw itself as an island nation destined to control the vast ocean beyond its shores. Naval doctrine centered on decisive, long-range strikes, fast, aggressive, and self-reliant. The G4M embodied that doctrine in metal form: long legs, high speed, little room for error. The Allies learned to exploit it mercilessly. In New Guinea, U.S. fighters ambushed formations of Betty bombers before they could reach their targets. In the Marianas, radar-guided interceptions tore through Japanese squadrons mid-air. And in the Philippines, P-38 Lightnings and F-6F Hellcats made the G4M's long-range missions suicidal. For the men flying them, every mission became a roll of the dice. Japanese war diaries captured the grim routine. Crews carried Lucky Charms, family letters, and small bottles of sake before takeoff. Mechanics quietly said goodbye to pilots they knew would not return. Some wrote farewell messages directly on the fuselage. In one surviving record from Rabaul, a Japanese captain wrote, "The Americans know where to shoot. The tanks burn fast. We will not come back. But we fly because it is our duty." The Allies, too, recognized the human cost behind the machine. American pilots who inspected the wreckage of downed Bettys often found charred remains fused to control panels, the result of instant, inescapable fires. It left even hardened veterans shaken. When captured airmen were interviewed, they confirmed what U.S. engineers already suspected. Most G4M crews didn't expect to survive beyond a few missions. "Our plane," one Japanese gunner told his captors in 1944, "is fast until it is hit." By that point, the G4M's reputation had spread across the Pacific. Allied pilots used the call sign Zippo for Betty bombers, a cruel nickname referencing the cigarette lighter. Despite its fatal flaws, the bomber remained a crucial asset in Japan's shrinking arsenal. It carried Oka suicide rockets, launched torpedo runs against Allied convoys, and served as Japan's first jet prototype test platform near war's end. The aircraft's versatility, if not its survivability, kept it flying long after it should have been retired. Yet for the American analysts who had first examined the captured Betty in the Solomon Islands, the lessons went far beyond engineering.
It became a symbol of how wartime desperation reshapes logic, how strategy bends under pressure, and how men are sent into battle by the arithmetic of necessity. By mid-1944, the captured G4M that started it all was transported to Eglin Field in Florida, where it underwent final testing under the U.S. Navy's Technical Air Intelligence Center. Engineers recorded every rivet, measured every control response, and preserved sections of the fuselage for study. The findings from those reports would soon influence Allied aircraft design philosophies and even post-war aviation safety standards. The American evaluation of the captured Betty didn't end with its disassembly. It became a case study, not in enemy aircraft design, but in the psychology of wartime engineering. At Eglin Field, the Technical Air Intelligence Center's engineers compared the G4M's structure with the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator. What they discovered wasn't merely a technological gap, it was a philosophical one. The Americans built for endurance. Every bomber in U.S. service carried layers of redundancy: reinforced airframes, self-sealing tanks, armored cockpits, and escape hatches positioned for crew survival. Survival wasn't just a feature, it was doctrine. A crew that lived could fight again. Japan, however, had built for reach and efficiency. The Betty was faster and lighter, capable of missions that U.S. bombers could not attempt without refueling. But that speed came at a price, a devastating one. Once hit, the Betty became a coffin in the sky. These findings were distributed across Allied design bureaus in 1944 and 1945. American manufacturers like Lockheed, North American, and Boeing were instructed to review the captured aircraft reports not for imitation, but for contrast. It reinforced a principle that shaped U.S. aircraft for decades to come. A machine of war must protect its operator first, or it will not endure. When Japan's surrender finally came in August 1945, the G4M's silhouette appeared one last time, in one of the most symbolic flights of the entire war. On August 19th, two unarmed Betty bombers took off from Atsugi Air Base near Tokyo. Painted completely white and marked with green crosses, they carried Japan's peace delegation to Ishima en route to General MacArthur's headquarters in Manila to discuss surrender terms. Photographs of that flight show the aircraft gliding low over the Pacific, engines humming quietly beneath cloud cover. Escorting American P-38 Lightnings flew alongside, weapons locked but never fired. For those who had studied the captured Betty in the Solomons, the image was haunting. The same aircraft that once symbolized Japan's reach and aggression now carried the men who came to end the war. When the white-painted Bettys landed, American officers were struck by how frail they appeared up close. The fuselages were patched with thin metal, the engines rattled with fatigue, and the smell of leaking fuel still hung in the air. Even in surrender, the plane's vulnerability was visible. In a final report, one U.S. intelligence officer noted, "The G4M's design tells the story of the Japanese war effort itself. Ambitious, ingenious, but fatally overextended." After the war, the surviving Bettys were scrapped, their frames melted down for post-war reconstruction materials. Only fragments remain today. A few engines in museums, a shattered fuselage in Papua New Guinea, and small relics displayed in hangars across Japan and the United States. But the legacy of that captured bomber lived on. The analysis directly influenced how American engineers approached balance in post-war designs, like the B-29 Superfortress and later the B-47 Stratojet. Fuel protection, fire suppression, and armored crew compartments became non-negotiable design standards, hard-learned lessons from studying Japan's flying fire trap. And for the Japanese engineers who survived the war, many reflected on the choices that led to it. Some later admitted that the G4M's design, though groundbreaking in 1939,
had become a death sentence by 1943. "We built for victory, but not for life," one former Mitsubishi designer said in 1946. As peace returned to the Pacific, the story of that captured Betty faded into archives and footnotes. Yet among aviation historians and wartime analysts, it remains a defining symbol, not of defeat, but of the thin line between brilliance and tragedy in human innovation. The aircraft that once terrified Allied ships had ultimately taught its enemies and its creators a lesson they would never forget. Its wings promised glory, its tanks delivered fire, and its legacy became a warning written in smoke across the Pacific sky. The story of the Betty bomber is more than a tale of metal, rivets, and fuel lines. It is a lesson in the extremes of human ambition. In the desperate years of the Pacific War, Japan's engineers pursued the impossible, a bomber that could cross oceans, strike with precision, and return safely home. And for a brief moment, the G4M achieved that dream. It roamed farther than any other twin-engine bomber of its time, from the jungles of Malaya to the vast blue void of the Central Pacific. But every mile it gained came at the cost of human life. Each unarmored tank, each unprotected gunner position, was a silent trade, range for survival, reach for safety. The engineers who designed it didn't just build an aircraft, they built a reflection of Japan's wartime doctrine itself: offense without hesitation, endurance without protection. For the American pilots who inspected that captured bomber, the revelation was sobering. They saw not just a flawed design, but a glimpse into the mindset of their enemy. Men who believed so completely in the mission that they accepted the inevitability of death as part of its design. In that sense, the Betty was both a marvel and a warning. A marvel because it demonstrated what could be achieved when vision outweighs limitation. A warning because it showed what happens when vision blinds itself to consequence. Decades later, aviation historians still point to the G4M as one of the most beautifully engineered failures of World War II, a machine that soared on ambition but fell to the physics of survival. And somewhere in a forgotten hangar on a humid Pacific island, one can still imagine the faint outline of that captured bomber sitting in the sunlight, olive paint faded, metal scarred, and its story etched forever into history. It stands as a quiet reminder of a time when nations built wings not just to fly, but to reach beyond fear, beyond reason, even beyond survival itself. Because in the end, the Betty wasn't simply a bomber. It was a question whispered across the sky. How far will mankind go to win a war?